I ask you to be sure and please silence your cell phone so that we don't interrupt the program. A little bit about our session. There'll be a 15-minute, well, potentially longer than 15-minute question and answer session at the end. Our presenters may choose to take a couple questions right after they present, but you'll definitely have time after our two presenters to bring up your questions at that point. So it's so good to see you all. It's really, really good to see everyone. So I'd like to introduce the coordinator of our session today, Greg Dobson. He's the Director of GIS and Engagement at UNC Asheville and the National Environmental Mapping and Application Center, NEMAC. He's been there since 2006, as we were just talking. So in his last 19 years, he's worked kind of at the intersection of GIS, climate, and the natural environment, focusing on collaborating with a lot of different stakeholders on the local, state, and national level. So Greg holds a master's degree in geography from Appalachian State University. And so I'd like to introduce Greg to introduce the panel.
Thanks, David. Can you all hear me okay? Is that coming through, Kent? Awesome. All right. So yeah, we want to talk about, in my discussion, I want to talk about technology, specifically geospatial technology is what I'm going to focus on over these next 15 minutes. And talk about some of the work that I did and that NEMAC did in the weeks and months following Hurricane Helene last fall. Just real quickly, though, I will talk briefly about what is NEMAC. So we are an applied research center on campus here at UNC Asheville. We recently celebrated our 20th anniversary as a center here on campus. We're a mix of research scientists, software developers, programmers, GIS experts, science communicators, educators, and we work to translate complex scientific data and turn that into useful decision support tools. And we work at a lot of different scales with a lot of different partners. We have a lot of local and regional partners, but we also work with a lot of the federal, national federal agencies, state governments, you name it. A big part of our focus is on the resilience of communities and our natural environments and helping them deal with a changing climate, a changing landscape. When we think about Hurricane Helene last fall, we think about major weather and natural disaster events. We try to work with communities to help them become better resilient to those types of events. And even though we do a lot of work, at the state level, at the national level, we, again, have some really close ties and partnerships with a lot of our folks right here in Asheville, with the city of Asheville, with Buncombe County, with our Land to Sky Regional Council. And so following Hurricane Helene last fall, I had some idea of what was going on in the local GIS, Buncombe County GIS department and the Emergency Operations Center. I have some friends that work in the GIS department for Buncombe County. So yeah, I reached out to say, hey, what can NEMAC do to help? So I want to tell a little story about what we did in the weeks following Hurricane Helene. Buncombe County, the Emergency Operations Center, was quickly inundated with help from all over the country, really. They had people from FEMA, they had people from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they had people from the Texas Division of Emergency Management, from the New York City Fire Department's geospatial team, which is really interesting. I wasn't familiar with that before last fall. So they had a lot of people in the room. People are trying to do damage assessments, search and rescue, recovery. There was a lot going on. And when you get into those situations, sometimes there's a lot of egos that get in the way. And so the Buncombe County emergency manager put a request to the GIS department and said, hey, we need an in-house damage assessment tool that will allow us to focus on all the different hazards that have happened. They wanted to look at tree damage, landslide damage, flood damage. We need a tool that's in-house that allows us to do that. So the manager of the GIS department, he called me one Sunday afternoon and said, hey, this is what we need. I don't have the capacity to do this. My team doesn't have the capacity. Can you guys help? And I said, sure, we're on it. So over the next few days, we put together this damage assessment tool that was going to allow us to do a heads-up visual inspection, if you will, of the damages that had occurred across the county. So we divided the county into 660 one-square-mile grid cells. And we had by that time, we had really good post-event, high-resolution aerial imagery. And that's really important when you have a natural disaster like this, to be able to zoom in and actually see, the damages on the landscape. So NOAA, the Civil Air Patrol, and a couple of private vendors had provided some really nice high-resolution imagery. So the goal was, we're going to use this imagery. We're not going to have boots on the ground for this. We're just going to zoom in on the imagery, and we're going to start marking damage points where we see it on the imagery. And so we spent the next couple of weeks doing just that. We actually were able to tap into a few other folks, some of our federal partners here locally in Asheville with NOAA, NCEI downtown, the National Centers for Environmental Information. The county did have a contractor that was helping them with some of this, the Timmons Group. And then we also had some ties, just kind of a weird circumstance of events. We had some ties to the University of Georgia's Geospatial Center and some of the grad students there. So we put together a team of like 20 people, and we started assigning these grid cells, groups of grid cells, to people to go through one by one and start marking where they saw damage on the imagery. This was a really unique collaboration because you had a local university hosting a geospatial application that's being edited by the federal government, by the local government, by other universities, by the private sector, probably stretching the limits of some IT protocols and some licensing, but at that time it just didn't really matter. We were trying to get a job done to help support local on-the-ground recovery efforts following Helene. Over the next, like I said, couple of weeks, we started, marking up this map. Zooms in a little bit there. You can see a lot of the flood damage there, those points that you see in blue that we were marking out in Swannanoa. This is an example of some landslide damage in the Broad River community. And then these are a bunch of bridges that were washed out up in the Barnardville community. So you can get a sense for some of the different types of damage and imagery that we were looking at. We needed a way to summarize this information and make it really digestible to the folks in the Emergency Operations Center. So we built a dashboard, and this is all, again, GIS, geospatial technology that we're using. We built a dashboard to summarize all that information. We collected almost 6,500 data points over those several weeks, and this was updated live. So every time a point was added to the map, this dashboard would update. They were using this dashboard in their daily briefings in the Emergency Operations Center, so it got a lot of great use in that way. And and it broke some things down too, like if you wanted to see specifics, the number of structures that were impacted, how many impacts were from floods, how many of the impacts were from landslides, and that sort of thing. So it just became a really great resource for looking at the impacts following Helene. As we went into the fall and things started to stabilize a little bit, we had another request that came through the Emergency Operations Center and through my contacts at the GIS department to build a similar tool, but focus just on assessing hazardous material in the rivers. And so they were concerned about all the different, vehicles and shipping containers and propane tanks and all that hazardous material that was in the rivers, lodged in the rivers, and wanting to get that out as quickly as possible before we had more floods and washes that stuff downstream. They still had at that time, help from the Army Corps and from the National Guard. So we stood up basically a replica of the damage assessment tool, this one to focus just on flood debris and just along the main riverways in the county. And again, we got a team together and divvied up some grid cells and did the same thing and started marking campers and tractor trailers and tractors and all kinds of things, and got that information to the folks that needed it as well. Moving along, we as more and more data started to roll in, one of the things we do at NEMAC, one of the things we do a lot of at NEMAC is visualization, different types of visualizations, trying to help convey, again, this complex data that not everyone easily understands. And so we started putting together some 3D visualizations to try to better understand what was going on, what some of these impacts look like. So this is Swannanoa, if you're familiar. There's the Ingalls in Swannanoa that has yet to reopen a year later after the storm. And what you see in orange is the 500-year floodplain. So not just the 100-year floodplain, but this is actually the 500-year floodplain. A 500-year floodplain means that in any given year, there's a 0.2% chance of a flood occurring that would exceed a 500-year flood event. So pretty rare, right? Well, we've got some pretty good early estimates from a variety of different sources indicating what the flood extent was of Hurricane Helene along the Swannanoa River. This is still preliminary, but we do know, in fact, that this entire area around Ingalls flooded. I mean, the store itself flooded. And, what this is showing is, this is 800 feet from the store to the edge of the 500-year floodplain, 800 feet. So that just gives you a sense for the magnitude of Helene last fall, flooding well beyond the 500-year floodplain. And we can turn the two on together, you kind of get a really good sense for, how much area was flooded there in that location. And in this imagery, you can see pretty well, all the mud and silt, in the parking lots and on the roads and, across the landscape there. Again, that's a really great piece of data, geospatial data that we rely on following events like this. Another thing that happened immediately following Helene was the collection of high water mark data from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They collected over 2,600 surveyed high water marks. We did a little visualization and analysis of that up in the Marshall community. So this is downtown Marshall. You can see those high water marks in red. This is normal flow here. But if we turn on the 500-year floodplain, we can compare that with the 500-year, with the high water marks, and actually do a little analysis there to say how close was that 500-year floodplain to those surveyed high water marks. And in fact, in Marshall, it was fairly close. It's a little steeper down there. The river can't spread out as far. Unfortunately, the water gets deeper, but those high water marks were, in fact, a pretty good indicator of what happened there. Another thing that can be useful, let's see if this works, is just animations. Again, a lot of folks don't understand maps and geospatial data, and so trying to get that into a format that might help them better visualize, better understand what you're trying to show can sometimes be a meaningful tool when you're talking with folks that don't know a lot about maps and geospatial data. We can do a similar thing with landslides. This is the Craigtown community in Buncombe County. This is just south of Black Mountain, kind of in the Fairview area. We had some major slides here. This is before and this is after. So you can see these slides coming down. This particular slide dropped 1,400 feet from the top of the mountain down to the valley here. Unfortunately, there were 13 lives lost in this slide, 11 from the same community, from the same family, the Craig family. So just some devastating impacts there. But sometimes these visualizations, again, can help us better understand some of these hazards. Here's another one up on the Parkway near North Carolina 80. This is at the intersection of McDowell and Mitchell County before and after. I mean, it's hard to even count the number of landslides that you see in the screen there. Again, the power of 3D GIS visualization to sometimes see these things a little bit better. Moving on into the winter, this past winter, we got involved with some local efforts assessing post-Helene wildfire risks. So yes, we had a lot of landslides and we had a lot of flooding, but we had an enormous amount of tree damage across western North Carolina. And we were in some discussions last winter with the City of Asheville Fire Department, with the North Carolina Forest Service, with the U.S. Forest Service, trying to get a handle on the scale of this. The early estimates are over 800,000 acres across western North Carolina have significant areas of significant downed trees. In Mitchell County alone, over 50% of the county has significant areas of downed trees. And so this poses an enhanced wildfire risk. North Carolina has the highest amount of wildland-urban interface of any state in the country. And so, here's a house here in the middle of the forest, and then after Helene, it's no longer in the middle of the forest. And so, again, this poses a significant wildfire risk, and we're trying to better understand that. Unlike a lot of hurricanes that strike the coast and you have a lot of tree damage at the coast, a lot of those are pine trees or softwoods. They rot and decay in a few years and go away. But here in the mountains, we're talking about oaks and hickories, really big oaks and hickories. And so this is not going to be an increased risk for another couple of years. This is going to be an increased risk for the next 15 to 20 years. And so local officials are really concerned about that. Of course, with the amount of trees that are down, it's hard to get into a lot of these remote areas and even fight a fire when they break out. And then the equipment that's needed, they need really big equipment to push these big trees around. So we're working with Forest Service. This is a tool we built called HighForm that analyzes forest health and looks at daily, or not daily, but regular satellite imagery to help better understand forest health and obviously impacts like wildfires and what that means on the landscape. So they're thinking about wildfire response. They're thinking about future fire behavior. It's harder to do prescribed fires now because, again, of the access issue. And then also, just thinking about the number, one of the things that we're starting to analyze at NEMAC with the Forest Service is, how many structures across Western North Carolina are at potentially an increased risk. We've come up with some early numbers of 40,000 structures are at an increased risk of wildfire following Helene. So some really important information for the fire managers out there. Lastly, I'll just make one last point here. We live in a world today where technology is everywhere. It's in our hands. We're with it 24 hours a day. We've got an enormous amount of geospatial technology at our fingertips through web maps. There's petabytes of geospatial data online that we can tap into and do analysis with and do these visualizations with. But what we found following Helene is that sometimes that technology is useless. If you don't have internet, if you don't have self-service, what we need are paper maps. And so we've heard story after story of people not having information that they needed. People didn't have paper maps, a map like this, which is a floodplain map, being able to, really focus on areas where search and rescue is needed. So while technology is great, and I'm all about technology, we do need to think about backup plans for those times where we don't have technology. And with that, I'll close. And I guess I'll let Holly come up and talk, and then maybe the both of us will take some questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Greg. That was really interesting. I learned a ton. It's also great to see some of our master's in climate resilience students here too, kind of catching this case study here, learning a lot, I'm sure. So we're really excited to have our second speaker as well. Holly Barham serves as the Director of Information Technology Services for the City of Asheville. She has been in that position since 2022. She joined the city in 2015 as a senior project manager. She's been leading crucial projects that have been enhancing security and operational efficiency through innovative technology. Holly's passionate about the interaction of people and technology. We talked a little bit about that earlier. And she works hard to ensure that technology serves as a bridge rather than a barrier. So welcome, Holly.
Thank you. Good morning. As introduced, I'm Holly Barham, and I do have the pleasure of serving as the director. Excuse me, sorry. Good morning. My name is Holly Barham, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Information Technology Services for the City of Asheville. You're going to hear a lot of parallels between my presentation and Greg's. GIS was a critical component. Paper is important in emergency response. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But I'm here today to share with you how the city leveraged technology to support the emergency response for Tropical Storm Helene and what that experience was like. How many of you were here in Asheville when Helene hit? All right, so most of you. It was a pretty scary experience. When I started pulling these slides together, it made me reflect on those events again. And at the city, we immediately transitioned from response into recovery, which is pretty intense on its own right. So that reflection was, putting these together was kind of the first time I slowed down and thought through like what that experience was like and thought about those experiences. There are quite a few pictures from the aftermath of the storm in here, and I share that as a little bit of a trigger warning. I know I had some feelings as I went through these slides, but here are some numbers that represent the magnitude of the event, and keep in mind this is only for the city of Asheville. This does not include Buncombe County at all. So over 200 rescues and hundreds of emergency evacuations, 1,000 plus miles searched. We did hazardous materials mitigation. We had 5 points of distribution with almost 4 million bottles of water distributed and over 250,000, MREs. Over 100 plus outside agencies responded. That's nonprofit, that's private sector, that's other counties and municipalities that came in to assist. Volunteer coordination, we had community care stations, and those were all based on the 48 areas of need that were identified. So before we get into how we leverage technology during the response, I want to give you some background information on emergency response in general. Wednesday, September 25th, department directors and city managers had a brief out. We knew we were in for a bad storm and we were activating the Emergency Operations Center. One of our major responsibilities as a municipality is to have on file emergency operation and continuity of operation plans. Fortunately, in Asheville, immediately after COVID, we took a fresh look at those plans. We spent over a year rewriting and practicing what we would do as an organization in an emergency situation with the hopes that we would never have to practice it in an emergency of this magnitude. That planning and preparedness paid off, and we continue to build on that preparedness. We learned a lot from Helene and will continue to improve based on, it's called the POETI model, if anybody is familiar with it. It means plan, organize, equip, train, exercise, and evaluate. And you keep running that circle to make sure that you continuously improve. So the lady in the red shirt, that's Miss Deborah Campbell. She is our city manager. She served as our incident command during the event, and that is our fire chief, Michael Case. We were in the Emergency Operations Center for that picture. So our Emergency Operations Center, or EOC, is fairly new. We're really fortunate to have a nice facility that is new because we spent a lot of time in there together. It also serves as Fire Station 13 and a police station. It's so new that while we were there during the response, we were conducting the warranty walkthroughs of that building. So the EOC was our headquarters. It was manned around the clock by staff from every department in the city. We had twice daily brief outs. When we were working on issues, you could walk across the room and access the resources you needed. For example, we would need to get fuel to a generator at a tower site. I could talk to Public Works about cutting a path to the tower site, as well as purchasing to make sure we were able to pay for that fuel, and then facilities so they could meet the fuel load at the tower. At one point, Public Works was having to cut a path so tight that we had to transport fuel on an ATV, which meant our fleet department was literally using their equipment to hoist up containers full of fuel to get it on the back of an ATV. It was truly all hands on deck, and being able to be in that EOC together and coordinate the response at the same time was critical to our success. So this is literally the brains of our operation. Security is super tight here. If something happened to the people in this room at the same time, it would have gotten worse quickly. So you can see there's FEMA, there was New Jersey was here, there were people from all over the country who came in to help. You can see we've got monitors set up, so we were watching drone footage, we had all kinds of different information up on those monitors. We had GIS dashboards pulled up so that we could help know where to go distribute resources. So this is a snippet from our Emergency Operations Plan, or EOP. I'm not going to read it to you. There are a lot of other tasks and subtasks that I'm not sharing, but it gives you an idea of what IT services has to account for in an emergency situation. And Helene really proved the value of having that plan. The city's investment in our Emergency Operations Plan and our Emergency Operations Center gave us the structure, the authorities, and the tools we needed to act quickly. So our continuity of operations plan, or our COOP, looks at our essential functions, the priority, and that return time objective. How quickly do we need to be back up and running with a certain essential function? So every department has their own COOP and EOP. We were very lucky during Helene. Our data center never went down. We had generator backup, and the fiber connection into City Hall was never interrupted. And honestly, I cannot imagine what it would have been like to deal with that on top of everything else. You'll notice that these essential functions map up with an upcoming slide, and it talks about IT's key priorities during the response. So this picture is the Swannanoa River. Up there, it's I'm going to forget the name of the apartment complex, River Mills Lofts, the ones that have the big pictures on there. So Thursday, September 26th, we woke up to hard rain, and that was after 2 weeks of off and on heavy rain and a very saturated ground. The usual roads were flooded, schools were closed, and Helene had showed us how extreme events share every part of that as response. The ITS division managers had our pre-planning meeting, and we were prepared to provide around-the-clock support to police and fire, public works, our water departments, as well as any other city departments that needed support. So that Thursday evening, Scott Barnwell, who's my deputy director, he graciously volunteered to cover the night shift and spent the night at the Emergency Operations Center. Little did we know that would be the first of many nights he spent the night there. He was there for probably 2 weeks straight at the night shift, which I will be eternally grateful for because I was there during the day. Scott's background is also GIS, and we were fortunate that he was the one who was there at night. Around midnight, the spillover system at the North Fork Water Treatment Plant alerted us how bad the flooding was going to be. So he immediately pulled up those same 100 and 500-year flood zone maps, and we provided them to public safety, who went around and literally knocked on doors and had the big air horns and sirens to alert people they needed to be able to evacuate. So this is the day after the storm, or this is the day the storm is hitting. At this point, the EOC is fully activated. We're manning it 24/7, and things are moving at a rapid pace. It is jam-packed in there. People are having to park across the street to even be able to get into that parking lot. And there are rescue teams out saving people. There are people trapped on roofs. Our public works folks, who are really some of the unsung heroes. When you talk about people who stepped up and had to step outside of their comfort zone to do work, really, if you see a public works employee, give them a hug. They need it probably still. But they were out chainsawing trees and unblocking roads, and our infrastructure just continued to keep breaking. Multiple lifelines, water, power, and communications were compromised, and it just kept adding to that complexity of the situation. So the power was out. We were on generator power at city buildings. Cell towers were literally falling over, or the fiber was cut to them. And then our water system lost its main line, and then the backup line from our largest reservoir. Needless to say, this was a very scary day. People were panicking because they can't reach out to their loved ones, nor do they have access to news and important information. And while it's going on, IT is prioritizing the work that needs to be done in the midst of that crisis. We had to make sure our EOC network was stable because it's our hub, it's our nexus of the response efforts. And we had to ensure we had reliable communication channels. GIS mapping was critical for search and rescue, for resource allocation, and for damage assessment. Cybersecurity was also a big concern because, as we know, malicious actors, they attack when you're vulnerable, and we were vulnerable. How many of you guys came out to either the EOC, a fire station, or any other city building to access the internet during the storm? Yeah, a couple of people. You might be able to find yourself in one of these pictures. So all those city buildings had people huddled around them trying to communicate with their family and friends. But all those external connections saturated our network, and so we started experiencing network degradation inside those buildings. We designed and implemented a new wireless network on the fly to address that impact. And there was a level of frustration that was bubbling up as communications and wireless connectivity struggled. Luckily, all the wired connections at city buildings were fully functional, but people really wanted that camaraderie. They wanted to be sitting in the same room together and working around a conference table, but you need wireless internet to do that, and it took us a couple days to get that network redesigned and up and running. But we were able to do it, and we alleviated that stress. We worked with Verizon to get cellular network extenders out at the EOC and all the fire stations. So at least in those buildings, we could use our cell signals. You guys also were able to benefit from that because it will distribute a pretty wide circumference. So outside of those buildings, some of the wireless signals were improved. Printers are a really big deal in emergency response. That EOC is fairly new, and we didn't have a plotter installed there yet, which is a really large printer, so you can print those GIS maps. So we went and stole one off the 3rd floor of City Hall, which is IT. We stole our own printer. We didn't steal somebody else's, whose name is Harry Plotter, by the way. But these machines are super sensitive. We should not, it's kind of risky for us to go take it, put it in the back of a car and transport it. Yes, he's shaking your head, yes. But we were desperate. We needed to be able to do it. And we couldn't just call our vendor. Like, our vendors were not open yet. There was no calling somebody to say, hey, we need help. So we got it there. Luckily, everything worked well. Got some feedback again? Okay. Printers, really big deal. We got the plotter installed. We were able to start printing those big maps. But you can even see, some of the big printout papers we have on the walls up there. And then you can see in that back table, there's literally multiple printers set up on tables. We were running out of toner and ink, and we could not go to the store and buy more toner and ink. But we could find in some cities outside of Asheville where we could just go buy a printer. So we literally bought a printer because it came with toner and ink so that we could keep printing documents. Because it's really, emergency response is paper heavy. You have to have that trail. FEMA wants you to print it, fill it out, pass it around the room, and file it away for later. So I had no idea how important paper was. So we also worked closely with major cellular carriers, even not the ones we usually contractually do business with. They all showed up with satellite communication trailers that could provide wireless internet, charging stations, and in some cases, even water and other supplies. So we have a climate justice data map, and we use that to identify locations that were the most vulnerable, and we would place the trailers there. We also worked with AT&T. We put dual SIM cards, which is what allows you access to your cellular provider. And so core city cell phones, we would put dual SIM cards in there and hope either Verizon or AT&T, one of them would have a signal so that we could start getting better cell signal. We also ordered jetpacks, so we had people from water who were going out and working at remote sites and needed to have those jetpacks to be able to communicate. This is at Asheville Middle School. You can see T-Mobile, we don't typically do business with. Their signal's getting a lot better, but in Asheville it's still improving. But they still came and showed up and had multiple trailers. They were also at our grant center. So our radio system is also a critical component of our infrastructure. And it's funny, we were talking about radios before here, and my brain went to handheld radios that public safety uses, and you guys were talking about radios where you broadcast a larger signal. So it's what you're used to, but it's dependent on daily in public safety, and especially in an emergency. So keeping those generators fueled at our radio tower sites was a top priority. And you can see the damage to this tower in the picture. It's just flopped over. It's clearly seen better days. Luckily, it mainly functioned as a repeater and we didn't lose functionality. We were really lucky that our radio system never went down during the storm. There is a backup radio system through the Highway Patrol that we can use in an emergency. And GIS. So as we've already talked about, it is a critical component from the very beginning of the response. After providing data for public safety to knock on doors for evacuations, they began mapping missing people and, unfortunately, human remains, as well as search and rescue dashboards. GIS was integral to managing those road closure communications. We used it to determine sites for food and water and supply distribution, and prioritizing those most vulnerable communities and coordinating with outside agencies that really showed up and knocked it out of the park. Our GIS team, just during that initial response, responded to over 118 requests to provide mapping tools for people. It's important to also note our fire department always shows up for other communities. You see in the news sometimes where we've deployed people to other communities who are having a crisis. And we're really lucky. They're well trained on a diverse set of rescues. And those reciprocal relationships really came in clutch for our community. People showed up and really did some amazing work. So a lot of the maps that we used during the storm have been taken down because they're no longer relevant, but I wanted to show you some of the ways that we continue to use GIS. You already heard about damage assessments through the county. The city did something similar. We used damage assessments immediately after the storm, and we're continuing to do so today. So our development services department, they're the ones who issue permits and do codes for buildings. They did what we called windshield surveys. They captured as much information as they could, including pictures, into an application called Survey 123. From there, the GIS team used an automation tool to push that data into FEMA reports. And then there was a larger site that had 20 to 30 locations in it. And all the information and pictures together fed them into a map that created this dashboard. Just 1 year ago, we moved all of our GIS resources off on-premise servers and into the cloud, which is really awesome and a big step forward for our department, until when Helene hit, it knocked out our direct connect, which is that pipeline that gets that data up into the cloud. So that was actually in Washington, in Virginia, that it got knocked out. So our GIS had limited functionality for about 24 hours until they could get that up. So we had to go back to the drawing board and re-architect, like, how are we resilient and redundant when we have those type of extreme situations? So we also provided technical support to multiple departments who use drone footage to access and assess damage to infrastructure, identify areas impacted by flooding and by landslides, and support search and rescue operations. So you can see the drones. That's actually the top of the municipal building downtown. We've got drones set up there that they can fly from. And then that's a public works truck. Those are people from both police and public works who are out doing those assessments. So this is a screen capture from drone footage, and that's the water main break. With the people in the picture, you can get an idea of the scale and a sense of how large that main is, and you can see how severe the damage is. Like, you can literally see that there is a tree inside of there. So having that drone footage was critical to be able to really get some early eyes on to see and assess the damage that we had. So we needed to get connectivity to fire stations and water treatment plants, because when the internet's down, well, that really impacts the work that they do. So we deployed Starlinks. We had some Starlinks on hand. We needed more. At one point, I literally drove in my car to Home Depot and bought 10 residential Starlinks to be able to set up. So we had them at all the fire stations and also the water treatment plants. But with Starlinks, they give you internet connectivity, but they don't get you on the city network. So it also took a lot of work to work with our firewalls and be able to get, at least at the water treatment plants, to be able to have that connectivity so that those servers and systems can talk to each other, so that we could stop manually running the water treatment plants. And we're going to be living in a construction zone for the foreseeable future, so we still have those set up so that when there is a fiber cut because of construction, we can fail over and keep running and be resilient. So all of our trucks and police vehicles are outfitted with technology, but we also have 2 larger vehicles, one that's used as a command center and another by the crisis negotiation team. They have AV equipment, they've got drones and cameras, and the networking on those is tricky. Networking is tricky in general, but when you put it in a really confined space like this, it makes it a little bit tougher. So we had just gotten those fully operational. They're somewhat new to the city just before the storm, so we'd have to send an IT person out in the field to troubleshoot on the fly. But those were also critical in being able to get eyes on the ground and set up at locations to assess damage. So when you have a natural disaster of this magnitude, you essentially have a large bullseye painted on your back. As I mentioned earlier, malicious actors, they take advantage of vulnerabilities. They don't care if you're in crisis. That makes you an easier target for them. So we were in our most vulnerable immediately following the storm. And so those first few days, we were working with a skeleton crew. I couldn't even make contact with my security coordinator for a few days. We had managers who couldn't get out of the neighborhoods because the trees were down and they couldn't leave to get into the EOC or into City Hall. So we really just were doing what we could with who we had available. And we were getting hit a lot by phishing emails, and they're smart, they were aimed at police and fire chiefs, they were aimed at the city manager's office, as well as across the entire employee base. They would pretend to say they had donations available. They really are tricky. So we knew we needed help, and so I reached out to the North Carolina Local Government Information Systems Association strike team. That is a mouthful, but they're a really amazing group of volunteers. They work in local government tech. They're led by Shannon Tufts, who's a professor at the UNC School of Government, and they immediately got to work setting up a remote security operations center. So they helped us monitor network and email traffic for a few months after the storm, and having that extra set of eyes on our systems while we worked on the response really, before we could get people into the office, was a huge relief. I slept a little better at night after those. Wouldn't say I slept well, but better. So that was important. So we have a site, I don't know if anybody has been to it yet, it's called AshevilleRecovers.org. In partnership with our communications and public engagement team, we built this. It's dedicated to the recovery efforts. So if you want any more information about what's going on with recovery, with the projects that are going on with that CDBGDR funds, you can go here and get more information. And you can also stay engaged. There's a link that says stay engaged, and if you visit that, it goes to an engagement hub. You can submit questions on that hub, and our communications and public engagement team will reach out and respond to those questions. So I encourage you to check out that website and ask any questions that you have. Our CAPE team is really great. And then I would be remiss not to share a picture of my amazing team. This was at our retreat at the Nature Center this year, but these are the dedicated people from the city IT department, along with every other person at the city who really stood up and was there during the response. So I just wanted to share that with you guys. So the key takeaways from this: Helene was an unprecedented weather event. We began preparing for it well before September 27th. Our emergency operations and continuity of operations plan were prepared and practiced well in advance, and they worked. The things that we identified in those plans are what we worked on during the storm. We provided around-the-clock support, not just in IT, but all of the departments in the city. And we're going to continue to work those plans. And that is all I have. So I will go sit down with Greg, and we will take questions.
Huge thanks. Our speakers today, we're running a little bit tight. We need some time to transition to the next session, but maybe we can take 2 quick questions if our mic runner is limbered up and ready to go. Thank you. Just raise it. Just question.
It seems like you guys were well prepared before September 27th. I'd like to know how come nobody else knew about it? Like we, as far as people in the community, had no idea.
About our level of preparedness? We had done some community engagement, and we're still continuing to work on that. So, I mean, I do know that our fire department and our communications and public engagement team had gone to some neighborhood meetings. I think they had visited some churches. They had gone to some community meetings and shared some of that information. But I will definitely take back to that team that we need to keep going.
In a very prompt after-action report from the State Budget Office, recommendation that islandable renewable microgrids for communications towers and other facilities similar to what Duke put in out at Mount Sterling in the Smokies just a few years ago, before they then also built the Hot Springs microgrid that was able to power the town of Hot Springs soon after, with the power line through the forest shut down. So the need for resilient electricity to power critical services has been established. What is the city, and for that matter, what is UNCA going to do in order to assure that we're prepared in the future?
So I do know we work closely with Duke, and I can take back to our city manager's office and ask that question, but I don't have an immediate response. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with that effort, but, you know, I know that there's a lot going on to figure out how we as a community, you know, whether it's the university, the city, the county, can become more resilient to the next event. And there will be another event, you know, I mean, Helene happened just 20 years after Hurricanes Francis and Ivan. So while these are 100-year and 500-year floods, obviously they're happening with much greater frequency. So, you know, hopefully the stakeholders and the decision makers are having those discussions about that. It's a little beyond what I deal with on a regular basis, but yeah, I can only hope that those discussions are happening, because you're right, we need redundant power systems. So I see just one other hand, maybe if we'll just call it after that.
Thank you so much for everything you did and are doing. Tears me up to hear. And my question is about Meshtastic networks for communication, and if there's any exploration of working with mesh networks, closed system mesh, and also if we can follow up with you after. I have connection with someone who's working on a regional mesh network who's very has a strong background in he helped design the internet, and I think it's critical. Community is everything, and being able to communicate with each other from Barnardsville to Swannanoa to, you know, across counties, et cetera. So yeah, just curious how far you have delved into that.
So we had started looking into that prior to the storm and working on a pilot. And honestly, right now, we're focused on working to get some of the FEMA reimbursements and rebuild what we already had, but it is on our radar.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the time.